I did throw in for everybody a PDF of the rectangular Boy Scout encampment patches. So it's basically a guide that I compiled from all of Rod's notes. So if you have any ones that you don't see here tonight that we don't know of, please send me. If you have a photo, please send me a photo. Please send me information on it. You can email it to me, and we'll get it added to the list. But Rod, I definitely have to give him, the tribute here for collecting all this information that he has over the years. But we linked up originally in 2015. Rod had an incredible collection of really every military themed military base strip, event patches, all that stuff, all the way back to the 40s, maybe even earlier. And he started to thin that out a little bit. So I bought some really, really nice Army stuff from him. And that kind of started off a good friendship. And finally in 2019, I was up in New England and able to meet for the first time. And we had fun up there, traveling to traderies and some of the museums when I was up in New England for about a year. So, Rod, if you want to give yourself an introduction.
Well, thank you. A pat on the back to you too for getting this going and compiling that list. I'm not too good with the computer end, and you certainly are, so I appreciate that. I started collecting military in general about 40 years ago, and it got unwieldy, so I pared it down to just Air Force, which I'm retired from. And so my collection over the last 25 years has been just Air Force, red and white strips, activity patches, anything with an airplane on it. And because of my age and health conditions, I've started to sell that whole thing off. Uh, so that's where I stand on it.
All right, so this is collecting explore rectangles, and so we'll go into what that is here in a minute. But kind of shown here are different examples. They all kind of have a similar form, shape, and theme. And then on the right there, Rod can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think paperwork for all this stuff, just like anything, is probably the rarest. But this is actually a piece I got from Rod. So all the scans you'll see in this were really between Rod with the most, and then myself. Our collection combined of the Explorer rectangles. Both of us have since sold off quite a bit of these. I've maintained my New York ones, and then several bases I've been to or have some sort of a connection to in my collection. But for the most part, I think there's only one person right now that has a pretty incredible collection. He received both mine and Rod's. But anyway, this is kind of what they look like, and there's a certificate of completion. So came from Air Training Command. Looks like an Air Force thing. Has all the Air Force signatures on it. Basically, um, signifying that the scout had completed the Explorer Air encampment. So it's a cool piece of paperwork to somebody would have framed with their completion of the Explorer event. All right. So what are Explorer rectangles? So my initial research. This is definitely rough math, so don't quote me on this, but um, factually between the 50s and 60s, especially coming out of World War II, there was a huge expansion of military bases across the U.S. and worldwide, especially Air Force and Army bases, as well as Army camps. Sometimes you'll see military base strip with a camp on it. Sometimes you see a fort. So that's just the difference between the camps and bases. And most of them kind of adopted the same name as bases really in the 50s and forward. Um, but there was over 100 installations opened between 1953 and 1970. I think the latest CSI guide had over 600 military base strip varieties. So all I'm trying to kind of say there is that there is definitely a plethora of military themed patches and a whole bunch of installations these came from. Um, Most of these seem to be unique to the 50s, 60s, 70s, really, really tapering off in the early 70s. Whether that's because of Vietnam or not, I don't know. But these seem to be most prevalent in the 50s, some in the 60s, and then really trailing off in the early 70s. What's kind of considered an Explorer rectangle is roughly 2 inches by 4 inches, either cut or rolled edge. There's a few exceptions that Rod notes in the checklist, and then we'll also see those examples here. But for the most part, it's a rectangle with some sort of military theme. Rolling into the next comment there, Rod collected over the years 65 different rectangles, and then 50. He noted 59 are military affiliated, and the Air Force was represented with the most with 44. And I think Rod, you had a few more talking points on various numbers, if that's correct.
Yes, briefly. Of the ones I identified, you're right. 59 military, 44 Air Force, 4 Army, 6 Navy, and 4 Marine Corps. 2 civilian fields and 4 unknowns. And just to add to the, seemed like the ending of these were in the late 60s, early 70s. When I was collecting event patches for Air Force bases, which were generally 3-inch rounds, the same thing happened. A lot of them. I had about maybe 200, 225 of them, and most of them were for the 50s and 60s. And very few of them from the 70s. And I don't know whether I always thought it was because of Vietnam and the fact that they had to go to a military base to have an activity. But I think now, when the Air Explorer program tailed off, was that in the late 60s when venturing took over? I'm not sure of the date, but I think it might coincide with that and not necessarily the military Vietnam connection.
Now, I would say that the patches kind of wore off about 75, 76, that time frame. And it wasn't because of the explosion of exploring, because we had aviation exploring in the 70s.
Correct.
But it was more than that. It was the fact that military bases started shrinking. They started consolidating operations and closing a lot of bases, and a lot of places just didn't have scouting anymore. They saw no need for it.
Right. Good point.
Deja vu.
Mike, yeah, I appreciate that. That makes sense. Yeah, just another aside, as Rod was talking about, and Mike brought that up. It is interesting because a lot of installations that are still active do have military Army bases, Air Force bases, and at least back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I've got at least one charter that there was actually military personnel who were appointed as either committee persons for troops, or might have even held a position. That was actually like an additional duty for them. So I think that's pretty cool that the military actually sought out, putting people in the troops to support them. And several that I've been part of actually have space on the post that it's used by Girl Scouts, Cub Scouts, Scouts BSA, maybe sometimes 4-H, but at least it's a building that the troop doesn't have to cover any of the overhead for. They have storage space; it can be locked, so there is still good support for the troops that do exist on post. So I think it's kind of a neat aside. Kind of going off of Rod's information, so the earliest dated rectangle that we found is 53. The latest is 89. You'll see both of those tonight. And this may seem like a really niche collection, and I think it is. I think it's definitely an interesting collecting area. But why does it appeal to everybody? I think, really it's, if you're looking deep in collecting council, state, regional events, explorer events, maybe military, I think that's why it really appeals to potentially everybody. As we went through this, there's 21 states represented, 1 territory, 1 country that all have 1 or more rectangles. So if you're looking to kind of complete that council collection, or you're looking for everything in your council, these might be some key pieces that to me are really interesting. I think to Rod, obviously, too, very interesting and unique pieces to have. New York, not surprising, has the most rectangles, 15. Those are 5 different bases. I still have most of mine being from Sampson, Griffiths, Stewart, and then the other 2 are Mitchell Field and Floyd Bennett. We'll talk more about. And like Mike said, many of these bases have changed names or closed. So looking at these, just like any of the other military event patches, it's kind of a unique glimpse of scouting history to see where scouts at training troops, events, whatever it may be. But we'll go through this alphabetically, and it's done by state. So unfortunately, I didn't do more research for everybody. It got a little daunting to try to figure out what councils these were in. So everyone can have this when we're done, but it does break it down by state. So I at least gave you that starting point. And again, if you want photos of these, you can have the PowerPoint, and then I'll also put a link to the U.S. Military Boy Scout Memorabilia Collectors Group that's on Facebook in the chat as well. And these are all actually in their own album, so you can go through and use the images as needed. So happy to share all the information with everybody. And again, Rod got me into this, and a lot of these are from his collection. So he did the long legwork over 40 years of collecting. Starting with Alaska, we've got Elmendorf and Ladd. Ladd was near Wainwright, since closed. And then Elmendorf is actually near Anchorage, and that's actually called Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson now. So it's overall an Army base, but Elmendorf Field or Elmendorf Air Force Base does still exist. Delaware, this is the only one from Delaware, from Dover. Florida, we've got several. Rod, I think you were saying the Missile Test Center is one of the tough ones.
That is a difficult one, yes.
Generic Explorer Conference, and then some of my favorite with the Mylar and the wings. So the wings look like Naval Aviator wings, but you have Naval Air Encampments, Pensacola, and then Pensacola is still active. It's actually where the Blue Angels are based out of. They've got a great Naval Aviation Museum there, but it's Naval Air Station, Pensacola. Fort Benning, these are some of my personal favorites. In fact, all three of these might have come from Rod. He had pretty choice pieces, so it's been hard to upgrade anything I got from him over the years.
That was a good trade.
But these are Army Airborne wings on the 63 and the 72 Army Airborne schools at Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, Georgia. And then the other Army Air Encampment there is the Officer Infantry Insignia and Gold Mylar. And the 1972 is actually the latest dated that we saw of these Explorer rectangles there on the bottom. Idaho, anything on this one, Rod?
I would just generally say anything from the Northwest is a bit rarer than the other ones we've seen. Anything from the Northwest is pretty rare. Maybe with the exception of Portland Air Force Base in Portland, Oregon. There's quite a few of those.
So here's Creve Corps Council. This one was easy to identify, coming from Illinois as Explorer Rendezvous. So not necessarily the military theme to it, but definitely fits the Explorer rectangle criteria, I guess. Four Rivers Council out of Kentucky, same thing, but definitely has those cool wings that we've seen in a lot of the other designs. So Maryland, and I'll pass this one over to Rod.
That's a pretty difficult one to get. Probably if on a 1 to 10 rating, I'd give it maybe an 8 and put it in dollar value, maybe 150.
And I think you're going to have one available. Is that right?
I do have one, yes.
All right. Massachusetts, so Otis, and then Cashelot Council.
And the Catch-A-Lot is the rare of the two.
Mississippi with Greenville Air Force Base.
That's a difficult one. Greenville, Mississippi, western Mississippi on the Mississippi River. They also had, I think, just 2 3-inch rounds from the 50s, 56 and 57, if I remember. So that's a pretty rare one there.
And pictures of all of Rod's Air Force stuff is also on the U.S. Military Boy Scout Memorabilia Collectors page on Facebook. So if you're looking for really a near complete collection of military base trips or any other event patches, all those photos are available there as well. Montana, I think several of these are pretty tough, like Rod was saying.
Correct.
So New Jersey, New Hampshire, Rutgers. This one I think Rod was looking for a photo for a while and finally got a photo of one.
Rutgers University is very, very difficult. Probably, I'd rank it as a 10, certainly. I've never had one. I only have a paper copy. Rutgers also held an encampment. It's a 3-inch round, which is fairly common, but I've never held a rectangular one in my hands.
The Fort Dix and McGuire. So that's one of two that Rod and I identified as a split Army Air Force encampment. So Fort Dix and McGuire are actually still active. It's actually Joint Base Dix McGuire now in New Jersey. And then the right, one of my favorites, Grenier Air Force Base in New Hampshire. And interestingly enough, when I was collecting these, the only uniform I've ever gotten that has an Explorer rectangle still sewn to it is actually one from Dover, New Hampshire, and it's an Explorer uniform with the Grenier Air Force Base rectangle sewn to it. So those are a couple of my favorites.
And Grenier, for the folks who go to the New England Tradery, Grenier is Manchester Airport.
Which they've got a cool little aviation museum there as well.
Yes, they do.
All right, New York. So going into New York, this state had the most Explorer rectangles. So, Rod, I think you've got a couple of other trivia numbers for us on these.
Yeah, I think Floyd Bennett has the most. I think they have 7 for that particular naval airfield, and it has 3 of them for 1 year. So apparently, the New York councils had individual encampments. In fact, you can see it said both of those are Queens Council, but there's another one that's Brooklyn Council. So I'm sure that they had they had more than one encampment per year for the New York councils.
Yeah, and depending on how you're flying into LaGuardia, you can actually see, I think, remnants of Mitchell Field still there in New York City. So these next ones are Floyd Bennett, like Rod was talking about. So we saw 3 in 1 year in 1955. And then the one without the year on the bottom there, and then the patch to the left is one of Rod's exceptions. The other being James Connolly Air Force Base. This is still a rectangle, just orientation is a little different, and theme still kind of fits. Just one of those exceptions that he's noted in the checklist. So these are ones that remain in my collection. Just kind of a cool connection to New York. These are interesting. The Griffiths Air Force ones, they're the only ones in this color green, which I think is cool. And then they had 1 year, I'm assuming they're different years, Explorer Skiing and then Explorer Survival. So I think those are pretty cool. And then the one on the left is the second combined Army Air Force one. And this is from northwestern New York, kind of way up towards the St. Lawrence Seaway. So this is Camp Drum at the time, and then Griffiths Air Force Base. And I actually think this is multiple councils as well. And this, I think, is the only one we've ever seen, right, Rod?
That is correct. That's on the 1 to 10 scale. That's a 12.
Thanks for not bidding too high against me.
Right.
And then continuing New York, Sampson Air Force Base. This is over towards Geneva, New York. And this is the one training certificate that I showed at the beginning. This is where this came from. Not sure which year it would have been, because these don't have the year on them, but cool nonetheless. And then another one of my favorites there on the bottom right, the only Explorer rectangle from Stewart Air Force Base, which is in Newburgh, New York. And that's where West Point, the United States Military Academy, did a lot of their air training over the years. And so they had a program, Wings of West Point. And I'm guessing this is probably somewhere around 1954, but again, don't know the year on this one.
The Sampsons are the most common. They probably trade in the $15 range. Sampson was the East Coast Air Force basic training site. The West Coast was at Parks Air Force Base in California, and then finally ended up at Lackland in San Antonio, Texas, in about 1960, I think. But the Sampsons are most, of all the strips, they're the most common.
These are ones I sold off, and I might be trying to get again, but these are all from Cherry Point, so that still exists as a Marine Corps Air Station. They've got several rescue units and then helicopter units there, amphibious units. Cherry Point, North Carolina. And these are interesting just because the years they span. 59 all the way to 70. And then I've always enjoyed the gold mylar wings and those, just like the Pensacola ones. Moving on to Ohio, here's several of them, and then the bottom left there, again, one of the exceptions to the Explorer rectangle, but still fits the theme at least. Last one for Ohio, so Shawnee Council, again, easy one to see the council on. Van Wert Airport, this really would have been associated with Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. In Oregon, these are ones that Rod said are tough. So you got Portland Air Force Base and then Portland International Air Base on the bottom right there. Any more on these, Rod?
There's quite a few from Portland. I don't have the number in my head. I would say at least a half a dozen. And I was actually stationed at Portland International Airport as a working with the Oregon Guard, and I never knew it was an Air Force base previous to my starting to collect these. But it shares the runway with the airport at Portland. But there are a couple, and I don't have that information in my head. There are a couple that are much more difficult than others.
So Rhode Island, Quonset Point. So this is basically just on the opposite side of the bay than Naval War College. This still exists as a like an Air Reserve base as well as an Army National Guard base. Texas, again, one of the exceptions I'd mentioned earlier to the Explorer rectangle. It's got the rounded edges, but still fits the category. This is James Connolly Air Force Base, and on bottom right, Shepherd Air Force Base.
The Shepherd is Shepherd had, instead of encampments, I think the run went for 12 years, 60s and early 70s. They had Explorer conclaves. They didn't call them encampments. But they had a run of, I think it was 12 straight years they had a patch. That's the only rectangle.
Virginia, Quantico, definitely still active. Huge Marine Corps base there. Washington, Rod will have to speak up on these. I think all of these have since closed, and I don't know if they're active at all as airports or Air Reserve bases or anything.
No, I believe they're all closed totally. Larson was at Moses Lake. Geiger was outside of Fairchild, Washington. And I'm sorry, Geiger, I'm confused. I think Geiger may have been in Everett, Washington, and may be part of the Boeing complex now. And Payne was from Fairchild. But those are all hard.
And then McCord, which I know you said is difficult as well, Rod. And then this is still active, same way that a lot of the bases have become Joint Army Air Force. Joint Base Lewis McCord out in Washington is still active.
That's
so it's
correct.
probably the latest of all those that we just saw from Washington.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Like I said, most anything from the Northwest is pretty difficult. I don't know whether that's because of the smaller numbers of kids that went to the encampments, fewer patches, but that's a difficult one. I'd rate it maybe an 8 or a 9.
Puerto Rico one, so there's total of 5, all coming from Ramey Air Force Base.
These have held their money well through the years. Only, I think, because of the Puerto Rico connection. Got some collectors in Puerto Rico that want everything from the island and are willing to pay for it, unlike my stateside friends. But those are pretty good. Probably a rating of maybe 7 or 8.
Yeah, I remember when we were going back and forth, I only ended up with one of these out of the 5.
I never had that one.
In Japan, I'll let Rod talk about these. This is one that I kept. I think these are pretty cool.
Yeah, this is probably dates to the 50s. It's the only rectangle from overseas, and they're all hand stitched, so every one is unique. You'll notice a difference in the lettering, or that even the fleur-de-lis might be a little different. On every one's a little bit different. So they're nice pieces to have. They're fairly common. I'd say maybe a 4 or 5. You see them quite often.
So these two I'd identified as at least not 100% sure on location. So if anybody does have an idea on these, always looking for more information on these. Rod, I think you said you have a couple of really good educated guesses on these.
Well, I would guess, a pure guess, that the blue one is from Portland, Oregon. And the one on the bottom right is because Maelstrom had other encampments that I might think that'd be Maelstrom in Montana. Pure guess.
And then getting to kind of the last piece that that Rod thought fit these Explorer rectangles. This one was from Jacksonville Naval Air Station, still active in 1989. So this kind of fits that quintessential rolled edge 2x4 inch rectangle. And then this is dated obviously 1989. So this is kind of the bookend 53 to 89, the way that we see these rectangles. So if anybody has anything that kind of fits this, typically military affiliated or air affiliated, that is a rectangle vent patch that kind of fits this criteria that's later than this, definitely be interested to see that. And then the winner for most rare, Rod, you can take it away on this one.
Well, this one, on a scale of 1 to 10, is a 15. I had never seen this before. In 40 years, it's the only one I've ever seen, and I happen to have possession of it. And my question to you guys is, what do you interpret that to be? I see trees. What are those streaks? Is that rain? I see a tent.
I always thought it was rain. It looks weird, but
it does look weird. And my thought train on that is, if it's rain, if it was a rainy encampment, was this patch produced after the encampment? That's really got me stumped. But East Coast wise, that's rarer than the Rutgers. The Rutgers is pretty rare.
So that's the presentation for tonight. Where on the uniform are the rectangles positioned? So the uniform that I have, it was actually, I think, on the upper right chest, above the Explorer BSA or Explorer tag on there. So interesting positioning of it. Kind of fits with what where the military would put either a skill badge on the left, or even like the air wings, or the aviator wings on the left side as well. I'm sure there could have been other spots or just in the pocket, but this one was interestingly on the chest.
And that's funny you bring that up, Larry. There's a lot of bases that you would think would have a ton of activity patches, and they don't. I mean, Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, or actually in Virginia, where they store Air Force One, to my knowledge, has one activity patch. And you would think that would be a very popular place for kids to go. So that's a good question. And Seymour Johnson, very, very few.